Fun.
Hey, Lee, you're muted, hon.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Virtual RVTEC. So we'll start with a few introductions. So different in departure from years past, there's been the UNOLS annual meeting sessions that have happened over the past several weeks. So those have been, the links for those have been shared in Slack. Today's meeting is also, it's being recorded and live streamed. So we're going to be using Slack for all the questions. So during presenters are going to present and questions will be received via Slack. That would happen today or the day of the presentations and all week. So presenters should be checking the respective Slack channels so that you can answer questions that may come in out of the week if people are able to join later to watch the presentation. We're going to try to stay on track with the time. So if we're early, that may equal a break so that people may join in and out during the sessions this week. We also have poster sessions. So those are in Google Drive. The link is in the Slack channel. So those have been added as they've come in. We also have introductory slides. It's been great to see everyone adding to those and seeing what people have been up to, challenges at your various institutions, and a lot of new faces. I think we have 200 people registered for this. So that is a record number. We also thank you to everyone who participated in the open social session yesterday. That was really fun. Got to see a lot of people I haven't seen in a while. Got to see some new faces as well. This week, UHDAS is going to, Jules has set up in the open social is going to do a social hour, I believe on Wednesday.
Yes.
On Wednesday, and so that's great. Feel welcome to create more if you're interested in having a social event about a specific topic and you want to share it. So you can talk to Brandy if that's something you're interested in. That's certainly recommended because that's one thing we're missing out on with RVTEC this year. Is usually there's these social interactions that lead to collaboration. Shared experiences, so that is welcome. What I have next here, so for some RVTEC business, so the RVTEC minutes from last year that Jules took are dropped into the Slack channel under introductions. So please read through those this week. I'll do a motion to accept those via Slack on the last day. And for 2021 RVTEC, we're not going to choose what a venue or anything yet. We just don't know. Too uncertain of what we'll be doing, so that won't be happening. If that does occur, I'll reach out to institutions that have been interested recently, and we'll figure out a way forward. So this is an all new format for the UNOLS office and for our various communities. So if you have any feedback, and some has already been put forth in the RVTEC mailing list, please let Brandy know. You can let myself know. You can let Jules know. And I want to thank Brandy for all her work, Alice for all her work in getting these for the annual meeting, getting that format changed, getting this so we can have a meeting and we can have presentations, we can talk, we can share experiences, we can exchange technical information. That it's very, very much appreciated. So thank you for that. I think I'm getting near the end of the list. Brandy, did I miss any of the details? Or
It was a very long list, so there were just a couple of things. Dale Chase had volunteered to do a training on transducers and oscilloscopes, but unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts and the nature of the virtual meeting, he's been unable to host that for us. So instead, later today, we'll have Kristen Bean, Mark Bushnell, and Katie Watkins-Brandt. The three of them will present on the status of the tech training committee and Ocean Best Practices repository, which looks really interesting. And again, there's a Slack channel for that if you have questions. I'm sorry, I should be muted. I am not sure if I heard you, but we also have a poster session. And for that, we're just dropping posters into a drive. There's a dedicated Slack channel where you can ask questions or talk about that, and we're dropping them in there. The links to that. I think that was most of it. Oh, the other thing is, because of the virtual nature and how we are all busy, we're going to try and keep to our time slots. So if we're running fast, we're probably just going to take a break rather than move on to the next presentation so that presenters can be ready at their time they've been told. Yeah, if we're running fast, you're going to get a chance to refill your coffee. I think that was it. Let me know if you have any questions or if you want to host an event and you need some logistic help. You can reach me in the Slack or email me, brandy@unols.org. I think that is all I have. Jim is here with us from NSF. Jim, would you like to make some opening remarks to our community?
Very, very few. First of all, a question. Most people aren't on the Zoom call. They're watching through YouTube. Is that right? Okay.
Correct.
Wow, we're fancy. So all I want to say is welcome. This is a great meeting. This is my very favorite meeting every year. I mean, unfortunately, we're doing it this way, but hey, it's different. It's a little bit of a experience. We're not in New Hampshire right now like we were going to be in. Whatever. Too bad, but it's still the best meeting. And the technicians rule. I mean, technicians are the highest life form, and everybody's figuring that out. And I love technicians, and we all do, and keep it going. And whatever you need from me, I'm here. End of story from Blabbermouth at NSF.
Well, our introductions ran 10 minutes fast. We're not prepared.
John Meyer would like to go get some coffee, I could see.
So today's presentations from SatNAG and HiSeasNet are Q&As. The idea being they've already made a presentation to the UNOLS annual meeting, and hopefully most have been able to see it. So as a result, rather than having them rehash their presentation, we thought perhaps the techs were going to have specific questions for them that they'd like to ask. So if you have questions for SatNAG or HiSeasNet to answer today, please pop into the Slack channel, SatNAG-HiSeasNet, and pop them in there now, and then in 10 minutes, we'll start answering them. I think if there's nothing else, then we could probably break until...
I got a quick question. Where are those introductions that everybody submitted?
I can send you a link. You can find them pinned in introductions, but I will send you a link, Jim.
In Slack, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But they're in the chat here now too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We're actually getting comments in Slack that say, "Is this on?" which is good, and a thumbs up. So people are here listening. They just haven't got questions yet. So get those questions in for SatNAG, and we can go over them in 10 minutes. If you all would like, we can take a break for 10 and come back.
Okay.
All right. 10 minutes,
10 minutes.
And I'll mute you all in the meantime. Remember, you're live on YouTube. We're coming back. It looks like folks are watching, which is great, and we are getting a couple of questions, some introductions, or not introductions, but some chat in Open Social. Got a couple of questions. Actually, let's introduce SatNAG and HiSeasNet. Let's introduce who we have here for that. Lee, would you be okay with that? Muted.
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I'll start with Laura. Do you want to introduce? I'll just call everyone out, and they can call each person's name, and you can introduce yourself, and then I think that's probably the best way to do it. You want to start, Laura?
Sure. Just popped up. I'm Laura Stolp. I work at HUI, part of SatNAG, and we've been working with the HiSeasNet folks on a lot of different projects this year. Next up is Eric.
I'm Eric at URI. I'm the new person in SatNAG. I joined in 2019, and looking forward to your questions.
John Haverlack.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Haverlack from University of Alaska Fairbanks. I work with RVTEC doing shoreside technical support. I've been a member of SatNAG, I think, from the beginning.
Ken?
Hi, I'm Ken Feldman. I'm at University of Washington. I also have been with SatNAG from the beginning. I work with the RV Thompson and the RV Carson at UW, primarily working on the data acquisition side and the satellite communication side, and also do some work with OOI on the cabled observatory. And as Laura said, we've been doing quite a lot. Well, we covered a lot in the introduction, so hopefully you've all seen that.
John Meyer.
Hey guys, John Meyer here. I'm Information Systems Manager at STS at SIO and oversee the HiSeasNet project. HiSeasNet's been a project at SIO since about 2002 and has gone through a number of transitions in the past 3 or 4 years, and happy to answer any questions about the state of affairs these days and the roadmap forward.
Great. I think that covers the introductions. How do we want to do some questions?
I dropped one in the chat that I copied from the SatNAG. I cheated and I seeded it. Maybe doing a Q&A this early in the week wasn't the best idea, and we should have done them later after more people were familiar with the Slack. But I know that in your presentation, there has been a Sophos firewall purchase done, and I was wondering if we wanted to perhaps explain the steps HiSeasNet and SatNAG took to get the units, and what techs in the fleet could experience in the near future when it comes to that.
I'll jump in on some of that. So one of the things we've agreed upon is that to date, we've been using a firewall system that encompasses having a daily quota. So the concept being there's not an infinite amount of bandwidth while underway. And rather than try and make decisions about what is right or wrong to block, give people a certain amount of bytes and kind of keep your traffic usage curtailed that way. This is based upon some perhaps antiquated now models that hotels used to offer, where you check in and you'd be given kind of a daily quota for your hotel room to get the free Wi-Fi or whatever. And that model has its benefits, but from a usability standpoint, it's really frustrating for a lot of people, because planning on curtailing your usage day in, day out, and learning how to do all that while you're there to do either support a scientific research or conduct the research yourself is a bit onerous. And so coupled with advanced feature sets that modern firewalls offer is the notion of doing things more based on throttling, but not blocking traffic altogether as feasible. It's really predicated on the notion that we would have an adequate amount of bandwidth to do that sort of traffic shaping rather than just outright traffic blocking. And so the Sophos firewall is based on the Cyberome, where we proved out the daily quota mechanism. But because the short-term vision here is we will continue to use quotas until it's practicable to do away with them, the need to have a stopgap solution for having a firewall that's compatible with that daily quota mechanism exists. And so if you look at some of the more enterprise-grade firewalls, kind of forerunners for that are Palo Alto or FortiGate, that offer a finer degree of granularity for segregating and your traffic and basically enhancing your cybersecurity capability. A firewall like Sophos XG is nearly there. It doesn't have some of the features that the more enterprise-grade firewalls would have. But the enterprise-grade firewalls, because it's not a feature people are looking for, don't have that ability to do that hard daily quota. And so as a transition gap, it was decided that we would get Sophos XGs to replace the aging and no longer supported Cyberomes within the fleet, to allow people to continue to work for the next 1-3 years, somewhere in that time range, and still be able to function while getting a firewall that's is probably fair to characterize. It's in like the 85% category range of capability compared to the firewalls that are desired to be deployed going forward.
Would anyone from SatNAG like to comment on perhaps the process? Or I know, for instance, there was some shuffling back and forth of who has the licenses. Are we expecting anything on the technician's part there?
Well, I think for the stopgap, for the most part, we're looking at just drop-in replacements for what exists currently, and for the most part, just license the way they have been, and with the idea being that as we come up with our next generation solution, that we'll take a look at that whole aspect of how are they being managed, how are they being maintained, distributed to the vessels, are they being maintained individually by each institution, or are we going to do that in a centralized fashion? So those are all open, larger questions that are interrelated.
It looks like Eric had asked a question, thank you, Eric, in the SatNAG channel about to the UNOLS community. You might want to ask that here, just in case folks aren't in the channel, so they jump in and answer, perhaps.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so the question I asked was how many of you out there are using PEP-Link devices, multi-WAN failover PEP-Links as your primary firewall? And I'm not sure if people are supposed to pipe up here or answer in the Slack channel. But
it's answer in the Slack channel.
Yeah, so it'd be great if you could pop into the Slack channel SatNAG group and just drop a line, let us know what you're using. Thank you.
In another topic,
John
might be
Haverlack,
good
you
for-
mentioned. Oh, John
Go ahead.
Haverlack
Go ahead,
raised his
Alice.
hand. Do you want to go ahead, John?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, as John had mentioned about using Captive Portal to manage bandwidth. With regards to the next gen firewall, it might also be that we want to start using Captive Portal to restrict access to internal networks on the ship. So as our cybersecurity ecosystem evolves, we might want to be able to give scientists access to a data acquisition network or something like that. And we can do that on a per user basis or something. So there's uses for Captive Portal in addition to just bandwidth management.
Yeah, to follow on to that, John, I didn't say we are using Captive Portal to identify who you are and then block you if you've used too much qualitative assessment. But yes, there is no desire to do away with having users authenticate on a shipboard network because once we know who you are, we can make decisions about your group membership and use that identity to allow access to internal networks as you suggest, and or allow, if there's a justifiable reason, to pursue a performance differential, something like that. So the long-term desire I think we've agreed on is that we want to do away with the hard limit of you use so many bytes in this 24-hour window, you're cut off.
I agree with
but
that.
There has to be
Absolutely,
there has to be sufficient throughput on the ships to be able to accommodate that too. So that's the goal. How practical and practicable it is to get there is to be determined.
I was going to say there have been some changes in SatNAG a little bit over the course of the last year, and some of that is maybe we should touch on the terms of reference that is being created. I know it's not released or anything like that, but maybe just maybe a little bit of overview of the SatNAG terms of reference, the importance to NSF in providing feedback to Jim. I think that maybe that's something. I think that's a topic worth communicating to this audience. Is that
Don't all
something?
jump at once, SatNAG.
Yeah, who from SatNAG might want to field that one?
Well, we're so right. We're putting together terms of reference of our goals and working with HiSeasNet folks going forward, and our expectations, Jim's expectations for what we do. It's still it's in review right now. I guess John and you, the HiSeasNet folks are having a look at it, and it'll give us a way to work forward and figure out who's responsible and how to work together, best to work together. And I guess it will be public once everyone's okay on it. So we'll just put it up on the SatNAG GUI, SatNAG DocuWiki. John?
Just to follow up on that, one of the key tenets that's communicated is working together to establish a reference architecture for the networks on ships. And really the motivation for that is, at least from a support standpoint, from what we faced over in HiSeasNet, is understanding how ships' networks are laid out allows us better troubleshooting capability. And at some point, there's an order of diminishing returns in having heterogeneity, so you have your most flexibility possible versus agreeing on a baseline of configuration so that it's easier for people to navigate as they go from ship to ship. So key point being, if I'm a scientist and I sail on a UNOL ship and I go from ship A to ship B, my internet experience should not be fundamentally different between those two things. And so some of that defining standards that we aim to work on together, some of this next generation firewall stuff that we're talking about would be in service of smoothing out some of that stuff.
So John, there's a question from Gabe about, I don't know if you can read the chat instead of my reading it, about the Marlink satellite swapping over to Norwegian advertisements. I know when the Fleet Broadband, we had that issue with that we went to Brazil a lot. And
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a known issue. So it requires a little bit of context. Yeah, that problem is appreciated, and we understand it's not desired. To go back to first principles, one of the priorities for HiSeasNet that's been communicated to us is to do financially efficient budgetary moves. That doesn't mean we have to go bottom of the barrel, but basically for the amount of bandwidth we've been buying and compared to what we've been doing, it was financially prudent for us to migrate the classic HiSeasNet service over to a commercial service. And that's, if you've gone from HiSeasNet to Sea-Link, there's only 2 ships currently on HiSeasNet Classic at this time. And when you do that, as Gabe points out, you do have varying Earth stations that you land on. And so there's a couple ways you can address that. But really our long-term roadmap that was not feasible to get to this year, we had hoped to get to it around this time of year originally, but with COVID-19, we've had to push that back, is ultimately we want to return to having an ISP provided tunnel that gets your ship's network traffic back to your institution sort of invisibly to you. And the way you can accomplish that is with a sort of standard ISP technology, multi-protocol label switching, MPLS, and it's in our contract to have that. Basically, we're going to have to do a transition ship by ship to get there, and it would be functionally a return to form of what users are used to seeing on traditional HiSeasNet, where your ship can be an extension of your campus network. So as desired, we do want to support that. And by doing the heavy lifting of having that ship traffic land at any ground station within the services network, and then having that ship back to a distribution point to get it back to your campus, essentially, we could avoid some of this looking like you're moving all around the world in terms of the internet and seeing Kroner advertisements, things like that. The way that's possible to do for both Sea-Link service, which would be sort of a return to form for HiSeasNet, as well as for Fleet Express, which, as Laura pointed out, has also been a pain point on occasion when your ship moves in extreme geographic locations. So that's desired. Getting there can be disruptive. What Link's made clear is that this is a service they would stand up in parallel to everything that's already present on current Sea-Link and or Fleet Express installations. So this would be an add-on that we desire to add on, and we just haven't had the people time to make that a project that we can accomplish to date, but it is in the roadmap, and it's something we aim to accomplish in 2021.
Thank you. So Robbie has a question about lost bits. I think he's alluding to when nobody's online and the bandwidth is just sitting there being unused, because with the captive portal, everyone has a limit, and I guess if you're not up to use it, but I think that would be done with more quality of service than a captive portal in the next gen firewall. John, do you have a thought?
So I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I'm tracking the nomenclature. Lost bits.
I think he's talking about when like nobody's using the bandwidth, nothing, like no one gets to use it ever. So
yeah, like leaving bread on the table. Yeah.
Back up Windows during that time. Right now we have it set such that it's a captive portal and you actually have to use it. We don't like kind of quality of service and saying, okay, if nobody's on the bandwidth, then you can go back up your, you know, if they're like a quality QoSing.
So, well, yeah. So one thing to start off with is it's important to understand that if you're a network engineer and you're looking at graphs of how networks are behaving, seeing a graph that is static and constant is the sign of an unhealthy network. And really unless, if you're streaming a lot, you might see that, but you don't want to see that at the upper limit of your throughput capability. And the reason for that is if you have no margin for suddenly moving some packets and being able to burst up above your kind of noise floor, you're always in saturated conditions. And the situation that creates in terms of networking is packets get lost, and then you end up doing a lot of retransmits, and it kind of creates this downward spiral in terms of performance where you end up in saturation all the time, and that's really a situation we're seeking to avoid. So some of this shift to commercial services gives us committed information rate as well as a maximum information rate. And that helps to avoid some of what I'm talking about, because the amount we can sustain is maybe this big, and then the amount you can burst is a little bit bigger. And so that gives you that headroom that you sort of need for that. But it gets really tricky in terms of, I paid for this many bits per second and I use this average and I didn't get what I paid for. That type of thinking is a slippery slope in terms of thinking you're getting what you paid for. Just because it's generally, you need space in networks to operate. And the allegory I like to draw from that is, people don't design freeways so that every square inch of the freeway is covered with cars. You need space to negotiate between lanes and kind of get from point A to point B. And so networks very similarly are like that. In particular, if they're kind of general use internet, where it's difficult to predict how people are going to use it, hour to hour, day to day sort of thing. If you're designing networks for a very specific situation where it's kind of robot machine talk, where you have very predictable traffic pattern, or you can tolerate some latency and introduce some throttling to kind of keep your traffic more predictable, that's a different story. But for I see Robbie's got an update here. Yeah, and so what he's saying is sometimes there's very little traffic, and what can we do about that? So yeah, is a quota system or QoS perfect for opening things up when there's capacity? Law of averages says the quota system could be, and QoS is more active tracking and should allow for more of that to happen. Part of the difficulty we've seen over the past 15 plus years that HiSeasNet's been working is that there's really a lower limit to how useful you can tune QoS and get the outcome that people want, which is sort of an equitable use of the link. We are increasing bandwidth as we figure out how to migrate to these more affordable services and figure out what we can afford as a fleet. But what I would discourage is, yes, a bit not used is a bit lost for forever. And this, internet satellite links are super duper expensive compared to what people are using at home. At the same time, I think it's important to make a distinction from the technical standpoint. That's true. A bit not used is a bit lost for forever. But there's a logistical need that we all have in any network we use, where unpredictable humans are involved, of having infrastructure available versus having it not be available or non-functional when you go to use it. And so there is overhead to be paid in terms of having capacity available so that you can go to use it.
Toby commented, and I think it's worth repeating, that freeways are a good analog. We all know freeways don't work well.
Yeah, I agree with John, and it's important to have that spare capacity. And the alternative is, if you fill up, you wind up resending a bunch of packets that don't get through, and we waste a lot more bits. So I suspect it's a worse scenario if we don't have enough capacity. We probably waste a lot more bits that way by resending packets than having, if we're saturated, than if we just have spare capacity.
Right, and on that note, so we're looking at the next generation firewalls. I think John was looking at Fortinets, and I have a couple Palo Altos, and part of it is the ability to, QoS the traffic so that if you can write the rule, if there's nothing else going on, there's lots of bandwidth, Windows updates can take 10%. But with what the bandwidth we have now, that 10% or 5% of what we have is like nothing, so it wouldn't really work very well. But the hope is that with more bandwidth, we could actually quality of service the traffic. I've been playing with a 2 megabit cell phone link in my son.
Yeah, I mean, QoS So we did do a HiSeasNet bandwidth upgrade a few years ago, and that upgrade, I think we did a 4x boost in 2014, and we were so desperate for bandwidth at that time, and basically that while it was certainly appreciated, it had little effect in terms of relief valve on demand. And it did improve our ability to do QoS, at least from the HiSeasNet ground station. We're able to more keep one ship from overwhelming the link a little bit better. But in terms of making sure your computer and your phone on ship are not dominating the link over everybody else's use, that's was remained a little bit trickier. With the shift to the C-Link service, as well as our adoption of the Fleet Express service, we did manage to boost bandwidth to double in a couple locations, and it's based on berthing capacity. And so it is now becoming more feasible to start to experiment with some of the stuff you're talking about, Laura, with the 2 megabit and things like that. Share my screen real quick. It's presented this at the annual meeting, but if we missed someone, I think it's worth revisiting. We did just commission C-Link system on Roger Revelle fresh out of midlife, and that opened up an opportunity for us to ask Marlink if they could give us a test shot, really kind of their maximum performance capability offshore. And so they were a little bit less clear than the way I'm saying it, but the basic punchline is they were able to provide that for almost no cost for a few days while the ship was conducting sea trials. And our network graph is down here below what we manifested during that time. And you can sort of see the usage pattern here, where the link was not super well prevailed upon within the first little time window. This graph basically shows when the ship was first underway with the super duper link, and as people were encouraged to use the link more heavily, like a shore link, then the usage characteristic became a lot higher. Some key takeaways we got from Bruce Applegate, who's on the ship, was that he was able to work very similarly to how he works in the office without much interference. So his productivity went way up. And a little watch down Lee gave me from the event when Lee was on board is that some of the troubleshooting and that was needed for making sure our instruments were commissioned and ready for service, there was a hugely more rapid turnaround time, because it was not onerous to say, you know what, we need to get this 500 megabytes of data over to experts for evaluation, and then help us with troubleshooting why this instrument that we bought isn't performing as desired. So not in the satellite world, but in some of the work I've done in previous job for remote firefighting stations here in San Diego County, we've seen this kind of bandwidth boost where you go up by a factor of 10 or more, just suddenly solve saturated all the time, pain point problems, and then doing more broad stroke network management techniques really become a lot more feasible, because your connection is a lot more normal. So you can do, rather than have this very specialized setup and trying to get every last bit you can out of that, there is some wisdom and benefit in the thinking of pay now, pay later. Right, currently what we've been doing in the fleet is using up a lot of people time to come up with creative solutions so that we can avoid paying for a lot of bandwidth. And recent experience on Revelle, at least, whether it's worth it or not to do all the time is we can certainly, is certainly debate about, but the benefit from a short burst thing like this on Revelle was very strong. It basically removed some of the need to have experts sail with the ship, and frankly made some significant problems that would have delayed use of some of our instruments go away, and able to have Revelle be able to troubleshoot instrumentation in kind of the early stage of getting the ship ready to work again.
Yeah. We had I would like to make a correction. There was a mistype, and Toby meant to say that freeways are not an analog he would point to. Also related to this test, Julian is asking what the approximate cost for that test was, and what would your monthly bill look like?
So this is a test shot, which is not always available. So if people want to know what exactly is involved, I can go through that, but without going through the details to start, what I will say is if you were to pay for this kind of capacity nominally, and what we had was about 60 megabits per second committed each way, with 70 to 100 megabits maximum rate on top of that. It's basically the kind of uplink you'd get on your cable modem at home. And the approximate costs you can expect to pay for having a leased airtime plan like that would be about $6,000 a day. So we got it for substantially cheaper, but that's again, there's no guarantees that that's possible.
Right. We're coming up on our time, but we have a couple of questions that I think we'd like to get to. I'm going to do this one first, Eric, from Web, because I think it's related to Robbie's earlier question. Is it possible to implement time-based QoS policies to prioritize traffics at different times of the day, i.e. Windows updates have more available bandwidth at night versus the day?
Yeah, with the newer next generation firewalls, we could do that. I mean, that's what we're looking into.
Some would say
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. We will have that capability, but I think it's tricky because it could create trying to manage and prioritize complicated sets of bandwidth. It could be extremely time consuming, and it can be very dynamic and changing. So I think we still want to try to find good broad brushstroke solutions that solve problems in general, even though they'll be more granular than they are now. And that may or may not be a specific use case that we would want to explore, but I think having that kind of capability are some of the features that we would like. That's my thought.
Just an add-on to that. I mean, that's certainly possible. It's possible now in the Sophos XG. Most firewalls with QoS have that capability. My question is, in terms of technical debt, how do I make sure I've got enough know-how on ship and somebody responsible for tracking time zone changes as the ship moves around? So while it's possible to do what we're talking about, what night is for a vessel working 24/7 is a matter of debate, although we generally seen a pretty diurnal thing where more people are sleeping at a certain time and there's a 8-ish hour window where there is more capacity available. Staying on top, making sure that's maintained adds work to somebody, or it doesn't work.
The other thing in this specific use case, the payload capacity of Windows updates might be so great that if we throttle it back, the amount of bandwidth we allow for it might not be sufficient enough for the updates to ever complete.
Right.
So, we have to make that work too.
Eric, you had a question. Would you like to ask that directly before we wrap up?
Yeah, I posted a question for the HiSeasNet group about, the two new systems that are going in place, the Fleet Express and the new Marlink systems. We moved away from committed bandwidth, from single carrier per channel bandwidth into a MIR-CIR model, and it creates a technical challenge in that what do you plan for? Because even though we're only guaranteed 500 kilobit, we typically see 2 to 3 megabit, which is a huge difference. But we don't necessarily want to have our QoS settings and our bandwidth limiter set to that. So I was just wondering if you guys know of any tools out there that could work with that. I hope I made the question clear enough.
You did. We've noticed this too. I'm frankly, I've been, we've only been leaning into the C-Link service at scale this year. So we're getting to know that service a bit better. And then with the transition from Fleet Express over to Marlink as well from WorldLink, there is a bit of difference in how some of that service behaves, although we did see some of this similar kind of behavior as well on the Fleet Express service. And a qualifier here is has nothing to do, we actually were doing MIR, CIR on HiSeasNet as well. So the single carrier per channel doesn't necessarily presume no QoS. It just adds less latency at layer 1, network layer 1. So, and the weird thing about C-Link is depending on the link that you get, if you do a bigger link, you may actually go over to single carrier per channel away from time division multiple access or a TDMA, which also adds some latency. So QoS can add some weird latency and jitter to your network, as can TDMA. And so those two things together can add up to create weird issues where you can't very effectively transfer a single session of data as fast as, nearly, maybe 25% of your available link capacity can be used for one TCP session, is where you might start to see issues manifest if you're having jitter issues with the combination of TDMA or QoS or both of them together. In terms of, seeing this way better performance than we're paying for, I don't really have a good answer to that, other than it seems like the carrier is giving us more capacity than we're paying for because there's probably more availability, and or their setup of their controls may not be as stringent as we expect. I haven't really gotten a clear answer on that at this point. And so, it's great when we have more, but then of course it sort of negatively impacts expectation management where. Yeah, you don't want to plan for the best. Yeah. And you also don't want to plan for the worst because it's somewhere in the middle, what you're actually getting. Yeah. So what I always encourage people to do is plan for the committed information rate. That's what we're paying for, and that's what is committed. Then if there is all this extra capacity, though, you will find that you're leaving bits on the table. And so, at this point, compared to a normal shoreline link, what we're able to currently provide within budget is well below where people's expectations are at. So I completely understand that knowing that you might have more and then artificially limiting it is not something that sounds very interesting to anybody. The only way I know how to guarantee that you're going to get the more steady level of performance is to pay for it and make sure that the carrier is providing that. In terms of the infrastructure that's under the hood, it's unlikely that burst capacity would go up if we paid for more committed rate. It would just cost us more money and give us more predictable outcomes. It's been a little surprising. Over in Fleet Express land, we can see up to 8 megabits sometimes, and we're only paying for 1. Good information rate for the larger ships, than 0.5 megabit for the smaller ships. And
that'll change as the customer base grows, right?
Yes. So I've been concerned about that. We watched this happen with Fleet Broadband when Fleet Broadband was first introduced. You went to, back in those days, 400 kilobits seemed like a lot, but when it was a relatively new network, you'd get on there and you could just push data, no problem. And as that customer base grew and grew and grew and grew, my perspective starting about maybe 4 years ago is you often ended up on that network and were not able to realize anywhere near the top of that 400 kilobit capability. So this is a challenging problem to predict and keep people updated on. The simplest way, again, would be to just pay for more committed information rate. But at least cost money, but it would cost a lot less logistics and guesswork on some of the issues you were speaking to.
Okay, I know we had a slow start and we have picked up some steam. There's lots of good conversation in the Slack, but we have hit our time. And so I would encourage folks to hop into the Slack and answer whatever questions you can find there. Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to both SatNAG and HiSeasNet for all the work they've done this year. It's been a lot of work and a year nobody could have ever planned for, and I think they're pulling off some amazing things between both of them. So thank you so much. And Lee, would you like to introduce our next host, our next speaker?
Yes. So we have John Haverlack is going to present on the Identity Management Engagement Report. So from March through September of 2020, John has been working with Josh Drake and Ryan Kaiser from Indiana University Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research to conduct a collaborative engagement for the ARF on identity management. So this has been a very interesting effort that he's put a lot of great work into. So yep, that's what John is going to present on now.
Okay, and thanks, Lee. Thanks for the introduction. And I just want to mention Josh Drake is also here. And so Josh, this is kind of a co-presentation. Please feel free to jump in at any time. And can we advance the next slide? All right. So the proposal, and my screen's being blocked there. There we go. Okay, so we developed an ARF identity management or IDM engagement plan, which we can view at the Google Doc link in the presentation. And the presentation, we added another month of time to it, so we actually went from May to October, and we came up with 3 milestones to catalog the current state of identity management in the fleet, to come up with a recommended IDM solution, and then to proof of concept test that solution. And so we're going to cover those 3 milestones in this presentation. Next slide. Okay, so what were our objectives of a federated IDM service? And so this engagement explored how to provide an opt-in per vessel, per service identity management solution, centralized identity management provide centralized identity management capabilities for the fleet, facilitate audible and the audibility of authentication events, monitor expired or inactive accounts for deactivation, reduce the use of shared user password accounts, leverage institutional identity providers rather than creating new identities, streamline on and offboard processes, and to develop a ship-side authentication appliance that could be hosted on board vessels. Okay. And so we as part of this engagement, we developed a identity management primer video, and the video link and the presentations there. If anybody's interested in seeing those, the presentation focused on explaining what is authentication, what is authorization, what are authentication services, how does audibility fit in, what are shared accounts and why we don't want to use them, and how a federated identity service would work. Okay. So in milestone 1, to identify the state of identity management in a fleet, we prepared a survey and sent it out. We got 10 institutions responded, representing about 15 vessels in the fleet. So just a quick summary of some of the answers. About 60% of our participants don't know how many institutional or internal accounts are accessed each year. 50% don't know how many transient accounts are used. 80% don't know how many inactive accounts are active and enabled. And then shared password role accounts are commonly used. That's where you have a single account with a shared password that many people use. Majority of credentials are managed locally on each device instead of centrally in a database. A small number of vessels do use Active Directory or LDAP for authentication. So there's some more advanced practices being used in places. End users do store passwords insecurely or write them down and post them in secure places. 60% only have a local system log. 20% have centralized logging. 10% regularly audit their logs. So not very, there was one respondent that was regularly auditing their logs, which is great, which the rest of us did. The majority said that they require strong passwords, and 30% of them said they're using two-factor authentication. So there's a mix of processes for adding and removing user accounts. No real consistency across the fleet. Next slide. We had survey respondents said that they would support a federated IDM for certain applications like cruise planning, captive portal, science logging, and file sharing. Somewhat of a mixed response with regards to supporting federated IDM for email, kiosks, virtual desktop integrations, systems administration functions, and such. They agree that federated IDM should never block logins if the internet is down, and it's strongly desired to have the ability to administer identities from vessel networks. We agree that federated IDM should be an opt-in on a per vessel, per service basis. Next. Okay, so milestone 2 was to come up with a recommended solution. So there's a lot of pieces and parts here that come together into place, but this is the general strategy. There is an in-common federation of which 43 of 58 UNOLS institutions are already members. So we can use identities from those institutions to log in to an identity service provider service. And there is a service called CI Logon that it was a National Science Foundation funded initiative that actually integrates the in-common service providers with Gmail and I think a couple others. So if you're not a member of in-common, but you have a Gmail account, you can still log in to the service using your existing institutional account, and then create an identity management service for the fleet using software called CoManage and Grouper, which are two other pieces of software that integrate together to then feed other identity services such as OpenLDAP, Active Directory, FreeIPA, or OpenID and OAuth. And then that would feed other shoreside services potentially. So the shoreside services that we're all interested in, if you want to log into something like, say, a cruise planner, for example, when you get prompted for the login, you would use your institutional ID, and this identity service would provide that authentication for you. And then we could leverage these downstream services to create ship-side OpenLDAP, FreeIPA, or Active Directory systems for authentication to clients onboard ships, including things like our Sophos firewalls, HTML5 web interfaces, potentially Samba, or maybe even Windows or Mac logins. Okay, next. Oh, I should have gone next. This is just a zoomed in version of that slide. Yep. So the way the workflow for this proposed solution goes is we have an enrollment process where we enroll users. So they would go to the RF Identity Management Services and log in to enroll. And upon logging in, they would be prompted to use their federated identity that already exists to log in. And that would create their account information within the RF Identity Management Services, CoManage and Grouper systems. If we have time, we'll talk more about the details of CoManage and Grouper and where we got with that. And then we might have a pre-cruise check-in where people, if they haven't checked in for a while, might want to just check in prior to a cruise. updated identity information would get provisioned to these authentication services, which would then get replicated to the per vessel services downstream. Next. So how far did we get in our proof of concept testing? Well, we didn't get that far, but we did get somewhere. We got these services, including CI login, were already existing. So we CI, or the co-manage folks, spun up a test co-manage instance for us because we were keeping things simple where we don't need to manage complex groups or groups of groups. We did not integrate grouper yet, but anticipate that we probably would need that for a more complex installation. So we got co-manage working. We were testing OpenLDAP, but did not successfully get that working. And that requires some schema work that we were working on. So I think we got close to getting OpenLDAP working. It is talking, it is getting information. But what we're not able to do is get a client, an LDAP client, to authenticate off of that LDAP server yet. So that will take some work. There's still work to be done on that if we decide to go down this route. And then we did not get very far with Active Directory testing and free IPA. We looked at it, but we did not actually get a test instance of that working, or OpenID or OAuth either. Next slide. Okay, there is, if we have time here, there's a 1-minute video here you can play to demonstrate the login process. So let's see if you can play that video. And if not, we'll just move on.
I'm not sure I can, John.
That's okay. All it does is it just demonstrates what the login process to co-manage looks like, and using my account, and it redirects me to my institution and then logs me in. Okay, next slide.
We'll make sure that's available when we post this.
That'd be great. So just a couple screenshots of what the co-manage interface looks like. So if we were to implement an identity management service, and again, this is a test instance, not a production instance, we can manage various different features. And if we go to the next slide, we'll just see a couple of screenshots of what capabilities are. So you can see what some of our users look like under the USRF people. We only have a handful in there. Next slide. And then you can manage groups of people. And next. We've got what are called enrollment flows for different ways to get people connected to the system. So basically managing your account. You're not creating an account, but you're enrolling them in the ARF identity management system using their existing accounts. Next. We've got collaborative organizational units. So we can use this to actually kind of create something akin to a group where we could maybe have science parties or staff members or crew or various other ways to organize people. And that's actually one of the complicated components. There's more than one way to organize institutions, organizations, and relationships in the system. And that's something we would have to figure out as a fleet. Next. And so some of the challenges, identity management is complicated. There's more than one way to organize data. Integrating authentication systems is hard. Once you get it working, it works, but it's hard to get working. Bidirectional administration on ships is not currently a feature that's available, but it is something that the co-manage folks are interested in potentially developing. So we might be able to work with them on that. The CI login annual subscription that we would be interested in is about $9,000 a year. And so that would be the direction we would pursue as an identity service to be able to access the upstream federated authentications. And then the other takeaway is, though, that there are resources here within the community to help us within co-manage. There's trainings for that. And then also the CI login folks. Next. So the next steps, if we decide to pursue this, I think would be to write a proposal to scope out the objectives, directives, and find the appropriate funding to do this, probably for a 5-year effort. We would pursue collaborations with CI Login, CI COE, Trusted CI, potentially the Marine Facilities Planner. We did meet with the Marine Facilities Planner guy and talked about how that might integrate. And it did not seem to be, once we have an identity service, it didn't seem like it would be a hard thing to integrate. And then request the funding to make it happen. Okay, I think that is the last slide.
Yep, John, and I would also point out that co-manage as well as CI Logon are started as NSF funded proposals, which then have transitioned to a practice-based model. So both of those have resources in the NSF community, and co-manage currently operated nominally by Internet 2, and a lot of their original developers of that provide access to consulting resources still through a private organization now.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Josh. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Well, you went right on time, which I appreciate. Thank you. So unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions,
Okay.
but I myself have personally started asking questions in the Slack channel. So
We'll
I
follow-
encourage everybody to follow up with John and Josh if you have any questions, and his answers will be available there in the Slack.
Thanks, Brandy.
Lee, would you like
Yep.
to introduce
Yeah.
Kate?
Yes, Kate Kuba is now going to present on network training lessons learned. And so this is the goals of this talk are to summarize the network training event that OSU hosted in February of 2020. How the training progressed, topics that we're focused on, and then concluding with the results of the post-event survey. So
Thanks,
thank you
Lee.
very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate. And this, like Lee said, is a quick overview of the network training event that was hosted by OSU in February of this year. Next slide. So what prompted this was RVTEC 2019, where Jeff Whiteside of UAF presented a Friday breakout session, and multiple attendees vocalized the benefit of that session, and OSU saw an opportunity to expand on this and make it more available for more technicians within UNOLS. Next slide. So we hosted a 2.5-day event covering the introduction to network organization and administration, which 30 Marine techs from 8 institutions, NOAA and the tech pool attended. Next slide. We also were able to partner with RCRV and do a small breakout session on that last half day, where Chris Ramos and Katie Watkins-Brandt were able to show the data presence shoreside cluster, as well as Katie's sensor calibration and testing lab. And it was a really nice introduction to the whole technician group, what RCRV is working towards, and the ability to test equipment before implementing it on the ship. All right, next session, next slide. So one of the big things with doing a training event is how do we quantify the success of this event? So we sat down and came up with some parameters to see how well this event worked and whether or not it would be useful to repeat in the future. So what we came up with was an initial survey that we gave all the participants through like Google Docs. We hosted the event with a very controlled Q&A sessions, which I'll touch back on later. And then we gave them a final survey, revisiting the questions in the initial survey to gauge how well the event went on. Next slide, please. So the first question we asked was, how familiar are you with basic network terminology? And we can see in the initial survey that it was a little bit of a wide span. I'd like to mention that 1 is very low knowledge or familiarity, and 5 is a very high comfort level with the information. And so we can see after the training event, people's comfort with the terminology used in talking to shoreside support increased. Next slide, please. And then how comfortable are you with solving issues on your network? So this one was really nice to see that we showed a full slide about 2 degrees of comfort in the participants, from being very uncomfortable or unsure of their knowledge to being able to solve an issue on their network. Next slide. How familiar are you with network diagnostic tools? So this one had the biggest switch, which was nice. We also presented these questions to Jeff before the initial results, before he came up with his teaching plan. And so he was able to like really drill down on these things that people were uncomfortable with or unfamiliar with. And this shows a really big movement from being unfamiliar with diagnostic tools to being very familiar with the tools available to our shipboard technicians. Next slide. And then how confident are you in discussing how your shipboard network is configured? The OSU technician group found that this was the best metric in understanding how well the training went, as most of the time when you're on board, you might be a solo technician like OSU is, and so you have to rely on shoreside support. And so if you're unable to communicate properly with shoreside support using jargon or diagnostic tools and things like that, we run into this hurdle that, you know, a lot of people aren't identifying as a hurdle. So this showed that the confidence level grew in our participants based on this training, based on being exposed to this jargon and other tools that are at their disposal. Next slide. We asked how many learning objectives were addressed, and most of the participants agreed that their learning objectives were met during this 2.5-day training, which was really, really nice to see. Next slide. And this is just some of the things that the feedback we got at the end from the participants about what they wanted, what they loved about it. And so for time being, I'll just kind of move forward past this one. Next slide. And so then we asked how we can make this training more accessible. Next slide, please. So we did this by making topic-specific training videos. We placed a directional microphone on Jeff during this presentation, and this allowed us to capture clean audio. We've all seen videos of training where a camera's been set up way in the back of the room, and it's hard to hear over all the noise in the room or hear exactly what the presenter is saying. So this way we got really nice and clean audio. We used the PowerPoint that Jeff had created for the lesson, and I was able to break down the training videos into sections clearly defined by Jeff's expertise. So they were all topic specific. We overlaid the clean audio onto Jeff's PowerPoint for easy to follow along training videos, which are anywhere between 5 and 20 minutes, depending on the topic covered. It was nice to be able to tailor these. In talking to Brandy, this is for the whole UNOLS. We're looking at how we're going to deliver these training videos that have been made. Jeff has given us our permission to put them publicly on the UNOLS YouTube. So that is something we can do, but if anybody has any suggestions on how they would like them, if they should be downloadable to keep on a ship or anything like that, please let us know. More feedback, the better. Next slide. And so then moving forward, looking into more of these trainings, more in-depth, a lot of the questions we got at the end were about specific hardware on board, either PEP links or cyberomes, switches that we're using. So moving forward, we're looking to doing this again, but maybe more, even more tailored than we did on this one, a bigger initial survey, getting a better idea of what people have questions about and want to learn about, and then utilizing the fleet and having maybe more than one presenter. and having it really tailored in. Next slide. And then these are just, again, a few of the things that the attendees said that they wanted to see, such as more real world examples and hands-on stuff, and then even maybe some hands-on training as to how to configure a Sophos or a PepLink. Yeah, and the last slide is just thanking our supporting foundations and allowing us to do this on such short notice. You know, RVTEC last year was October. We put this together by February, so we're really thankful for the support we got in being able to do this. I guess I should look at some questions.
Thanks to OSU for taking the initiative to do this.
Yeah, it was really great to do, and it seemed to benefit a lot. And we capped it off at 30 participants, and we definitely know we could have made it more robust.
I think I might ask Jim if he's still on the line to pipe in here a little bit. Some of the things that go into making a training like this is identifying the subject matter expertise and an individual willing to take the time, and an institution. This grew really fast for you guys, able to do it. And then once we know that it's something that we need and we have somebody who can say it and share it and the facility to run it, it seems like Jim is willing to fund training like that. Am I speaking for you, Jim?
Please do. You've got it all right so far. I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't want to make a liar out of myself, but I don't think I've ever turned down reasonable training for people. It's one of these things that, well, I might say you have to cut your budget, then you got to cut the training, but I've never said specifically you need to cut training. In fact, to the contrary. Andrew's done a really good job there trying to get this together, and also more training than he's doing with his people, sending them to Healy or Sekuliak, sorry. So yeah, I don't want to sound trite, but I totally support it. It's great. In fact, I was curious how this all had gone. So it's a good presentation.
Yeah. Yeah. So if there are trainings that people think that they have to host, or if they have the content or
something else, Brandy, not only training, but also using ship days for testing and calibrations. We've done that both at Woods Hole and Scripps. It's something it goes into training, but it also goes into, being ready and having some engineering time for getting ready for all the science. And that's going to be particularly important, I believe, having had such few science days and going on to a very busy next year.
Yeah, and once the videos are live, I would love any feedback that everybody has and how they were presented, the format we used, and whether or not it's useful. They do take a lot of work to produce, so if it's something that has a lot of benefit, it's definitely something we can move forward and keep doing with other trainings to make those really available to the fleet. But if they're not working out for people, I would love to be able to take that energy into a different direction where it can be very useful.
Yeah, that's the point, right? We need them to be, if they aren't useful, then what are we doing? But I'm really glad that the live event was so valuable. I've heard such good things about it afterward.
Thank you.
Again, we are at about our time. Thank you for being on time. You're all doing such a good job. So Lee, if you'd like to introduce our next speaker. And again, this conversation can continue in the Slack channel for network training. So pop your questions in there. Thank you, Kate.
Yep. So next we have Karen Stocks from R2R to talk about data roles and responsibilities. So this is a document that they've been working on with after discussions with their advisory panel, I believe, their advisory group. So I'll turn it over to Karen.
Thank you. Let me just take a moment to share my slides here. All right, can you all see that at this point? Look good? Okay, thank you. So yes, I am part of the Rolling Deck Repository, or R2R team. And today I'm going to be talking, it's going to be a fairly focused presentation. I'm going to put most of the time into this new document that Lee just mentioned, but because I know we always have new people at RVTEC every year, I'm going to do just a quick summary of a few of the key best practices for cruise data distributions. If you're interested in hearing more of an overview introduction to R2R or hearing about some of our new areas of development, I encourage you to watch and listen to Suzanne's UNOL's presentation. It was recorded earlier and you can see the link there. Okay. If you are fairly new, or if you just haven't done it in a while, I encourage you to have a look at the R2R page that's for ship operators. We have a bunch of best practices listed there with a fair amount of detail. So have a look there. I'm just going to pull out now a couple of the sort of highlights that we wanted to convey. So for cruise data, we do ask that you create a MD5 checksum file for the full distribution. For documentation such as calibration sheets, if you're providing them, we ask you to separate them from the data and then organize by device within that. And we are looking to try to break out more and manage more documentation in addition to data. So we're going to be developing some guidance on that soon. If you do happen to find that you have some data from a cruise that you didn't pass off, we know this happens. It would be great if you could create a new supplemental cruise distribution and hand that to us. If you simply recreate the whole cruise distribution, then we're not quite sure what's changed and we might have to repeat a lot of the breakout and processing that we've done. We ask if you please not to change the cruise IDs after the fact. We use that as a unique identifier that percolates all the way through R2R and into NCEI, so that gets a bit messy to change. Please try to only include data from within that cruise in the cruise distribution. Sometimes we get data that may be left over or was used for comparison, something like that. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of consistent file naming and directory structures. We do work with a variety of data, but I wanted to highlight a couple of navigation file recommendations because nav is
Karen,
really
I'm going to interrupt you really quick.
Sure.
We're still seeing your title slide.
Oh, no, because I am saying shoot, and we went through this today. Okay. Let me try to share in a different way. So I'm going to share.
You can go into full screen mode. That might be useful too.
There we go.
There you go. That's
okay, good. So let me, at this point, I think I have the time to go back and let me do the presentation. Okay, so are we now on the second slide?
We are on the outline, yes.
Okay, so important thing here is there is that link. These slides will be available later on, but if you want to see the full R2R cruise, you can go there. This is going to be your URL for those best practices, documents and guidance that we're talking about. Here is the best practices for cruise data. I don't want to talk through them again because we've already had them, but you can refer back to them. And we're here on navigation data, I think. Sorry about that. So the navigation data files are really important for providing that location information for those sensors that don't include it. So we do ask for standalone nav from all cruises. We sell about 15% of cruises where we're not getting that. We'd really like to get that up to 100%. We have some format recommendations here. We will take it in the format you provide, but if you're willing to do the NMEA recommendations, that's great. Speed over ground, course over ground, recommended but not required. Try to record at full resolution, at least 1 Hertz, and to start new files daily. So that was a pretty quick spin through some of the key best practices we wanted to really highlight, moving on to this new document, the data roles and responsibilities. So the motivation for R2R in creating this was twofold. First, we think it's important to have a real clear understanding with both the operators, technicians, and with the chief scientists about what R2R does and what we're looking to you guys to help us with. And secondly, R2R is assessing its compliance with something called Core Trust Seal requirements. This is an international certification that's given to data repositories to show that they're trustworthy. And some of the concepts in the roles and responsibilities are things that, as we go towards Core Trust Seal certification, they would want to see. And what I'm going to give you is going to be just sort of a brief summary. But I ask you, if you're interested, please have a look at that full document, which is linked there. And I'm just going to do a check. Are we still good with the slides, seeing what we expect to see? Excellent.
Motivation.
All right. Okay, so the pathway for this document is it was developed by R2R. We presented it to our advisory committee in July to get their feedback. That was important because the advisory committee holds a variety of kinds of people. It has, operator types of people as well, but it has a fair few people who are seagoing scientists. So we see that as our ability to sort of check in with the chief scientists and say, does this fit with your expectations? Is there anything here that's concerning? We're now bringing it to RVTEC to get your feedback, and we will fly it by NSF. So Jim, don't worry, this won't get out of the stable before you've had a chance to look at it. So getting right into it, it's organized to talk about the roles and responsibilities for these three different groups. The operators, we can call them operators/technicians, the chief scientists, and R2R. For the operators, we're looking at you to collect the routine underway data, and there is a definition of what we mean by that in the full document, and provide that to R2R along with metadata and documentation that's necessary to use the data, ideally as soon after the cruise as tractable. We ask you to provide complete cruise metadata in addition to the sensor data metadata. If you're willing to use the UNOLS Cruise Personnel Manifest spreadsheet, that's a great format for us to take. If that doesn't work for you for some reason, please check our metadata page because we do have certain elements that we ask that you include. We ask operators to ensure, along with the chief scientist, that inappropriate content for long-term preservation isn't in those cruise distributions. So that's things like personally identifiable information, copyrighted files. That's because that complete cruise distribution as is gets sort of deep archived to NCI, as well as R2R keeping copies. And we really don't want anything there that shouldn't be there. And then to provide data files in a documented format, ideally providing some of our following some of our recommendations. NCEI, which is our National Archive, is increasingly insistent that they really don't want to take data if there isn't a description of the format of the data. So even though some of these files are coming off in sensor formats that are really widely known and understood by the communities, it's good to have a description of that format because, 10, 20, 50 years down the road, it may not be as obvious what those mean. And then finally, we ask that operators use a consistent cruise directory structure and to work with us in regular vessel profiler reviews. Please let us know if there are changes to that, things like changes in the devices, in the directory structure, for data or documentation, in the way files are formatted or named. You can do this either by logging into the vessel profiler and adjusting it yourself, or just contact us and we'll work with you from there. And the reason why this is really important is because the distributions are big, and R2R has a mostly automated process for breaking out the data in the distributions, and that relies on having consistent patterns that we're looking for. And if data are moved or the way the files are named is changed, we won't break it out, and we don't always know what we're not getting because instruments are turned on and off. We really have no way of knowing if we're missing something. So that's why it's so critical. So as far as the chief scientist's responsibilities, we're asking them to respond to our data release request. They don't have to release the data, but we ask them to respond one way or another. And it's for them to know the data policies of their funding source. By and large, most of the funding agencies are requiring that data be publicly released within a certain amount of time. But there are certainly special circumstances, and the chief scientist is the only one who really knows that. R2R never releases data without the chief scientist's approval. The chief scientist needs to manage the science party data. Any of those mission-specific instruments that were brought on by the science party, R2R doesn't do those data, so they're responsible for whatever their data management expectations are from their funding agency. We ask the scientists to work with the operators on making sure nothing is in that distribution that shouldn't get saved in the long term. And if possible, to submit cruise reports to R2R. They're really useful for people trying to use the data. And we have a way of making them visible and accessible. In the cruise catalog, we provide DOIs so they can be cited by others. So that's the chief scientist's work. Then for R2R's, nope, that actually jumped 2. There we go. For R2R's work, it is our job to ensure the long-term archive of cruise data as received by the operator. So when you hand it off to us, we're very diligent about making sure there's a copy that gets deep archived at the NOAA National Centers for Environmental Informatics. We also keep 2 copies in separate locations. We manage the data release requests to the chief scientists. We provide the R2R cruise catalog as a public discovery and access point for the data, as well as for the cruise DOIs. We see those cruise DOIs as an important way of connecting information from a given cruise across different data repositories and across publications. For most of the underway devices, we break out the data, we create standard documentation, and we submit it to NCEI for discovery and access there, as well as through R2R, if it's a data type they take. If not, we serve it. And for certain data products, we do some QA/QC, and or we have some standard data products that we create, and we also make those available through R2R and NCEI. So that is the document in a nutshell. I'd be very interested in feedback from this group. We want to make sure this is a document that works for all. So some specific questions there are these stated roles and responsibilities reasonable and appropriate? Is there anything important that we're missing? How should this be communicated to chief scientists? We can post it on the R2R website, but chief scientists aren't necessarily going to know to go there. So is there a place in the pre-cruise planning process that maybe this can be exposed to the scientists? And are there areas for further detail and agreement? We're not talking so much about specific device best practices. That's important work. But for example, there was one area that was raised by the advisory committee to R2R. They wanted to see language stating that it's the responsibility of the operator to ensure that instruments are all calibrated and ready for use by the chief scientist on the cruise. We understand that that is not as simple as it sounds, and that there are resource and time limitations, and the calibration that's appropriate for one science use may not be appropriate for another. So that's not something we put in this current draft, but one that we might want to put on the table for community discussion and working towards a consensus there. Also, the challenge of when a cruise goes through a restricted EEZ where the data can't be shared, is it, for example, reasonable to ask the operators to turn those instruments off while they're in the EEZ? R2R doesn't necessarily know when cruises go in and out. And we we don't snip out subsections of data. So if a cruise went in a restricted EEZ and data from an instrument can't be shared from that EEZ, R2R can't share any of the data from that cruise, from that instrument. So it effectively becomes lost to science. So the idea of turning the instruments off is a good one to R2R. You can let us know if it's a good practice for operators. So at that point, that's our question. I would really love to take some of the remaining time to field some of the comments or discussion live. So I think, let's see, if I go to chat and Slack, I believe you don't see that or do you see that at this point?
We don't. We
Okay.
currently don't have any live questions, but I think Lee has one for you.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I did bring this up with Jim Hollick at NSF about the calibration of sonars. So something that I have seen is that the expectations of chief scientists in regards to sonar calibrations are not in alignment with the what the technical groups are doing or are able to support. There is a misalignment with expectations in regards to sonar calibrations. And then that kind of exposed too that we've never really written down, and we have NSF inspections, but we've never written down that, you know, you calibrate your CTD sensors should be calibrated every 6 months. You know, so some documentation, and that's not all on R2R, but I think a community consensus, as you put it, on calibration expectations for the users and for the technical groups is something we need to do as a companion to this. So that's something that that I'm interested in.
Thank you for that, Lee. I appreciate it. And I think, you know, this gets out of the direct relationship of what R2R sort of needs from each group and more between chief scientists and operators. But R2R in its recent award is taking a role in best practice development. It started that with transmissometers. And so I think we are happy to work with the community to kind of bring a table and a process through which these things can be raised. And we can put calibration expectations and specifically the sonar ones on the priority list. I think we'd want to reach out to those in R2R as well as elsewhere we usually do this through working groups. So we have some representative members on a working group to come up with a draft that then gets a wider community discussion and comment. Are there other thoughts, feedback on this? And we will keep looking at the Slack. I know a lot of people aren't doing this in real time.
We have had a question from Brandon Dandria. Interesting to know about the data release request sent to Chief Sci. Was not aware of this step. Do they have exclusivity for as long as they want, or is it made public after a certain period of time? I'm sure this depends on the funding source, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and he put his finger on it right at the end. We don't have any automatic release clock unless it's given to us by the chief scientist. So sometimes the chief scientist says, I want to have a release on this for, you know, until this date. And at that point, after the date passes, I think we send a courtesy reminder, but we do release it. But outside of that, we never release without the chief scientist's okay. And that is because the funding sources and the, you know, mission specific situations can vary, and R2R doesn't know all of those details, and we really can't. So we do rely on the chief scientist to be the one to let those data out.
As part of the OCE data policy, which is, again, not everybody, but when it's NSF OCE, the default is 2 years, after which it's the PI's responsibility to get the data archived. And that's one of the reasons why we formed R2R, because the PIs were not doing that. So yeah, the onus is on them afterwards. I'm just curious, what percentage, probably very, very low, is saying they putting a hold on these data?
I know that about 93% are released immediately. I don't have final numbers for if you track an individual cruise. I expect that does go up a little bit through time, but yes, over 90% are pretty much immediately released and made public.
Good.
I do see a question, yes, about releasing models based on vessel. We haven't really looked at vessel class as a criteria for releasing data. It's more about the funding source there. Let's see, are there other questions in Slack?
There's a question from Robbie about metadata.
Okay, let me scroll back up to that. I think it's gotten a little bit buried. Settings for some instruments can be something like hash 01B5C7. While this might be in the data or the metadata, you really need the entire manual to truly know what the data is. Are some vessels sending portions of the manuals? We have only started really looking into what currently is in the distributions with respect to documentation and manuals. I think I'm going to defer answering this question to let Drew Clark, who's been doing that work, reply in Slack when he has an opportunity. And then I think I'm about out of time. But I'm just leaving up a slide for not for real-time discussion, but sort of for consideration later on, which is we're really interested in what your vessel's practices are when tied up at the dock. Do you collect data? If so, what data? Do you get it to R2R? Do you mark it in any way? So if you'll let me just have that up for a minute, and I'll invite people to just send up thoughts in our Slack channel. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
So does that take us to our time, Brandy, or should I look at that?
It does take us to our time. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to break so that not everybody's sitting in front of the computer for 3 hours. So we have a 10-minute break built in now. You can leave this slide up if you want for the break, and we will come back on the hour with, I buried my agenda. But I believe it is Kristen Beam with Tech Training and the Ocean Best Practices presentation, which I think there's been some conversations with R2R about that as well, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, go ahead, refill your coffee, use the facilities, mute yourself, and probably turn off your camera, and we'll be back on the hour.
I think we're ready for the next presentation here at 12:01. Brandy, are we streaming on still? Or? Okay, I'll go ahead and start with so the next presentation is going to be a tech training update and a presentation on ocean best practices presented by Kristen Beam, Mark Bushnell, and Katie Watkins Brandt. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Like Lee said, I'm really excited to be here with you guys today. I'm going to be doing a quick update on the tech training subcommittee and kind of what we've been up to for the last year or a couple of years. I'm really excited to see already all the conversations going on in Slack with people very interested in both best practices and in regards to training. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So right now we are at 4 members. So it's myself, Kristen Beam, Brett Hembrow, Gabe and Juliana, and those are both 2 newer members. And then Nick Matthews and Tony Dow are both outgoing. So with that, we have space for 2 new members. We're taking nominations for that now. So if you're interested, email any one of us or Brandy or Alice. But our preferred method is that email right there, the techtraining@unals.org. We're all very passionate about technician training and wanting kind of the best for the seagoing technicians. So if you guys are passionate as well, come join our team. Also, if you have any ideas, please email us as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's some previous ideas that we've kind of developed over the years in regards to technician training, including creating our own trainings, identifying training opportunities aboard vessels of the U.S. academic research fleet, a repository of resources built on existing experience and materials, and recording training sessions. And we'll kind of break down each one of these with different things that we've already done, as well as difficulties. So next slide, please. So difficulties, creating our own training is very time intensive. As you just heard from Kate Kuba, it is, these trainings do usually go really well. Technicians are very excited to do these in-person training and get a lot out of it. But it is pretty time intensive. And Brandy mentioned in the Slack earlier that we have kind of developed a how to do your own training guide. So we'll send that out later in an email, but that's something that we've done. Identifying opportunities aboard research vessels. We actually had a couple different things lined up in place this year, and then COVID-19 happened. A repository of kind of building out this experience and materials. Data mining is pretty time intensive, and perhaps we won't have to actually start from scratch. Kind of stand by on that. And then recording training sessions is also, like you heard from Kate, is professionally expensive and or time intensive. So I'm not saying that these are excuses or reasons why we shouldn't do these trainings. We're just kind of being very apparent with what we've done and kind of the difficulties and hurdles. So next slide. So what now? For these trainings, we're going to go ahead and put on hold and watch for opportunities. So if you hear about opportunities and or want to put something together, please contact us. As far as sailing aboard research vessels, we're standing by for reduced restrictions. And then, like I was saying, for this repository of resources built on existing experiences, and there's some Slack messages coming in just a few minutes ago, where manuals kind of come and go. Maybe we don't have to kind of hold on to that repository and start from scratch. Maybe we can build some partnerships with other folks, which is why Katie and Mark will talk about Ocean's best practices pretty soon. And then in terms of recording training sessions, Kate was also highlighting the advantages of going the way that she went. But again, it's pretty time intensive. So stand by for the videos from the network training at OSU. Next slide. Additional next steps, please send us your nominations for new committee members at the email address. And then also send us, kind of your ideas and what you would like to see from our subcommittee. We are really open for more dialogue and we're really passionate about what we do. So feel free to just drop us a line, send us a ping, do whatever you need to do. And that concludes my portion. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Katie and Mark, and they're going to go ahead and talk about Ocean's best practices.
All right, thanks, Kristen. So next slide, please. Thank you. So hi, everyone. We're going to kind of switch gears a little bit here and talk about an initiative that we have come up with to hopefully bridge the RVTEC and OBPS communities. And we wanted to start with an introduction to OBPS because we're actually not sure how many of you are familiar with the Ocean Best Practices system. So here in a moment, I'll introduce you to Mark, and he will give you a rundown of its background and capabilities. Following his introduction, I will describe our initiative, who the group members are, and kind of how we came about this idea, and what our plans are for the development of best practice documents for specifically seagoing operations and accompanying decision trees as well, and the participation of beta testing these best practice documents. So one more thing before I introduce you to Mark, please do subscribe to our RVTEC Slack channel. It wasn't created with the original batch, so it didn't automatically join you to the channel. So please go in and join and ask questions, make comments. We'll be monitoring the channel all week. So with that said, I'd like to introduce you to Mark Bushnell. His primary position is with NOAA and as the National Coordinator for IUCE and CORTOD. In addition, he's on the steering group for OBPS and working group for the US CLIVAR for uncertainty quantification. And Mark really plays a pretty large part in the development of marine best practices and data quality standards. So with that, I'll let you go ahead, Mark, and take it away. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Katie. Hope I'm coming through okay. Ocean Best Practice System started about 4 years ago. We just finished our 4th annual workshop. And the purpose of these workshops is to find out how we can help communities as they struggle to come up with best practices. One of the very first things we had to figure out is just exactly what is a best practice. So you see the definition there circled in red. And basically it's something that works better than similar methods and more than one entity is using it. It's a pretty straightforward approach definition, and it's what you would think a best practice is. I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on the repository just because it's really the kernel of the Ocean Best Practice System. And so you can see on the right there, we've got 1,144 submissions so far. Let's go to the next slide. Just an introduction to the Ocean Best Practice System. We hope it's a permanent repository. That's our intention. When we got started with this, a lot of best practices reside in somebody's drawer or on one laptop. They're hard to find. They're hard to share. The goal here was to make them findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable. The FAIR theory. We partnered with a peer-reviewed journal, Frontiers in Marine Science. So if you want to get a peer review, you can go down that route. But when you submit a document to the repository, it needn't be peer-reviewed. It needn't be on a scale of 1 to 10 on a readiness level. It can be a 1. These are all fields that you'll be filling out yourself. And all it takes is an individual who believes that this is something that should be shared. Your name's going to be associated with it. So if people question it, they'll get in touch with you. We're working on this web-based training and capacity development. We have 7 work packages within Ocean Best Practice System. That's one of them as the training and capacity development. We have one video recording in the repository that is a training video. So that's a capability that we have. And then I mentioned we've had these workshops, 4 of them now, trying to figure out how we can help folks like RVTEC. We really are a tool for you to use. We're thrilled that you've found us and are interested in it. We just last week finished a steering group meeting where we took the output of the 4th workshop and are figuring out how to go forward for the next 2, 3, 5, and 10 years. Next slide. So I thought I'd just walk you through a typical search of the repository, and I know that this transmissometer document was recently submitted. So I searched for transmissometers, and it pops up at the top of the list. You can see there are 52 documents in the repository that have the word transmissometer in them somewhere. Next slide. So you click on that document and it pulls up this page where you can see the abstract. You have an opportunity to download the document. And next slide, you scroll down and here you can see one of the neatest things I think is that the documents are assigned to DOI. So they're readily referenced. You just put, we have a citation that's created in there. And another neat feature there circled in the lower right is the view usage statistics. So if we go to the next slide, you can see how many times it's been downloaded by month and by country. Neat statistics if, at the end of the year, you're trying to justify your existence and you want to show how useful your documents are. So it's tools like that we've created, I haven't created, we've created that make your job easier. Next slide. Now the search is not like Google, and I stumbled on this myself, and I bet you might too. I'm used to just type some words into Google and out comes 10 million bits sorted by what Google thinks is your interest levels. This is an iterative thing. So here I've searched for transmissometer and then I've added shipboard, and you can choose between and or not. And so you can refine the search. And after refining it to include quality control and real time, you can see we're down to 17 documents that should be of interest to you. A lot of work went into this search engine. There's a lot more to creating a search than I was aware of. The guy who's in charge of this would point out that I think we have 5 or 6 ontologies that are searched, and they're linked so that over there in that left-hand column, it'll pull up words that are related to what you're searching for, and it may help you further refine your search. There's a lot going on behind the scenes in this search of the repository. Next slide. We have a newsletter, comes out monthly, and it's a gal, Rachel in Australia, who writes it. And I don't know how many of you have written newsletters before, but you're always begging for content. And we're pretty keen to have a RVTEC article. I think we've got somebody signed up to submit one. So there's the web link where you can go see the past newsletters. And in the September issue, I wrote just a short note about how easy is it to deposit something into the repository. And I timed myself, I took notes, and that about doubled the time. I think after you've done your first one, it takes perhaps 15 minutes to do the second one once you're familiar with it. It really is easy. So in this article, not only do I describe how easy it is, but I point to other documents that have been created to help people learn how to deposit them, submit them, and so forth. Several resources at the bottom of this article. So if it's your first time, have a look at this, or contact any of us on the steering group. We'll be glad to help you. Next slide. We have a forum. This is another thing that was, I somehow wound up being the poor sap that's in charge of the forum. And I found out that trolls and spammers are a real and highly capable group of something, people or not. And they swamped the first time we stood this up because the default settings in this MyBP software we use were not nearly restrictive enough. And so now, actually, to sign up, you got to jump through a fair number of hoops before one of the administrators will admit you into the forum. But it's there, and we've got these 4 sub forums. We're happy to create another sub forum. It sounds like you guys have your own, but we could create an RVTEC or some transmissometer forum if you wanted. As long as it's relevant, we're happy to support it. Next slide. We have documents that will help you generate a best practice. This BP4BP is, if you just go to the repository and search for that, you'll see a preprint of a document that describes techniques for creating a best practice. And then we have templates. The 2 documents on the right, well, it's one document, 2 pages of I think it was a 14-page document, describes how you would set up a best practice for an oceanographic sensor. It's just go in and fill in the blanks for whatever you choose to create one for. You don't have to use it. It's just another tool we hope that you find useful. Next slide. Last slide. So we're almost all volunteers. We've got support from the International Oceanographic Commission. And so we get a project manager and about half of an IT professional's time. We get together monthly. I've mentioned the annual workshops. And again, we're here to help. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm not looking at the Slack channel right now, but I am looking at the chat here for the Zoom call. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Next slide, please. So that was a really great introduction into OBPS. So again, thank you for that. And I wanted to take a moment and just put some names to faces and introduce you to our group members and really let you know that what brought us together was really our common interest in promoting development of best practices for seagoing operations. And it was really after this recent OBPS workshop earlier this year that it became really clear that there was a need to kind of bridge the RVTEC and OBPS communities because we understand the importance of marine technicians in sensor maintenance and management and the resultant data quality. So we came together to promote participation of marine technicians in development of best practices because we are actively working to produce more documents like the transmissometer one that Mark showed you there. And we really do want your input. So before I go too far into it, let me introduce you to our group. My name is Katie Watkins Brandt. I am the sensor systems engineer for the Regional Class Research Vessel Project. Kristen Beam, who just provided a great update as a member of the UNOLS Tech Training Committee. We're also very, very lucky to have her join the RCRV project as the Marine Science Systems Engineer. Sean Smith with Rolling Deck Repository Samos and co-ops at Florida State University. Y'all are very familiar with him, as well as Laura Stolp and Rebecca Hudak, who work with Rolling Deck Repository, as well as the HUI Shipboard Scientific Support Group. Jay Perlman is with IEEE France. He's also the director of 4 Bridges, and he's on the steering group for OBPS, and Mark Bushnell, who I introduced earlier and who gave that great introduction to OBPS. Next, please. So lastly, we hope that many of you will join us on this endeavor. As Jim said earlier, technicians are the highest life form. I could not agree more. And we need you to be a part of this process to make the best documents possible to share with the community. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we are actively working on producing best practice documents for seagoing operations. One is currently being led by Hui on with Rebecca and Laura on CTD best practices, and one by R2R on general underway best practices. But we recently produced this best practices for shipboard underway transmissometers and published it at OBPS, as Mark showed you. And the goal of this document was really to provide best practices for operators such as yourselves that will improve access to transmissometer data and metadata to support routine data quality evaluation and science application. So please do go check out the R2R presentation during the UNOLS session 4 on instrumentation and data facilities. And if you haven't already, go to Ocean Best Practices and check out this document. Last year, I believe at RVTEC, Sean gave a presentation about this best practice, and it received a lot of positive feedback from technicians. And, you know, we realized that there was a real advantage to continuing this effort and developing more documents like this one. So since its publication in April, we have had, 648 views. I think Mark actually showed there were more, which is great, and a lot of positive feedback. So we really want to continue on this route. And then the last thing I'll say about this slide is, Becca not only helped with the development of the best practice document, but also acted as our beta tester. And she provided us with this plot showing data values kind of pre and post cruise following our best practice document and applying the corrected values to the data. So you're not going to be able to see me with my mouse kind of show you around, but I'll give you a quick rundown of kind of what we're looking at. So on the x-axis or on the y-axis there, it's transmittance. On the x-axis is time. And you can see the first two lines of the legend, pre-25 in olive green and post-25 in blue, represents a 25 centimeter path length sea star. And then there's also a pre-10 in green and a post-10 in purple. And that represents a 10 centimeter path length sea star. So both configurations were running during this cruise. And what's really important to note here is that the post 10 and post 25 values in blue and purple, they show the corrected values after the field calibrations were applied. And it really demonstrates that biofouling was a factor in the data. Because remember, what we're looking at is transmittance. So lower the values in the pre-10 and pre-25 lines represent biofouling of the system. So once that system is cleaned and these new field calibrations are applied, the transmittance is higher because you're actually getting more light penetrating through the flow cell because the windows have been cleaned. So this is a great proof of concept, and it really demonstrates that even over a short period of time, biofouling can occur and affect the data. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are our goals? Well, we'd really like to leverage the wealth of knowledge in the marine technician community and encourage your participation in the development of these best practice documents for seagoing operations. You all have the expertise. You work with these instruments all the time, so let's bring your experience to the table. Alongside these best practice documents, we are looking at developing decision trees. We wholly understand that your time is often limited at sea and you may really only have 5 minutes to assess a sensor. So these decision trees will kind of accompany these best practices to highlight time-based suggestions for sensor maintenance and calibration. And then lastly, we'd really like to recruit beta testers to try out these best practice documents as they become available and provide feedback on how it actually went. Next slide, please. So why should you get involved? Well, we think standardization of best practices is a real need in the community, and I think most marine technicians would agree. To your already demanding job, there is some added ambiguity of how to care for shipboard sensors. A scientist might come on board and have their own way of doing things. I'm sure we've all experienced this. A sensor manual may have another recommendation, and you may have your own. So which one is correct? Honestly, probably all of them. So I think that there is a real opportunity for us to come together, compile this knowledge, and provide a guiding document of best practices. Leverage of calibration funding. So this kind of got brought up a little bit earlier. Do you always have a good handle on when you should or shouldn't calibrate? Is it annually? Is it every 2 years? Is it every 6 months? So within these documents, we'll provide, guidance on that issue as well. And we think this will really help with kind of the standardization of calibrations in the fleet. And HUI's actually already started this effort with a general guide as to when you should consider calibrations. Professional development. So I think this is something that we don't consider nearly enough in this community. I've been a technician for over 10 years now, and unfortunately, you don't get many opportunities to share the wealth of knowledge that you have. So this is a real opportunity to publish a best practice document with your name on it and take pride in that. I think that's really important to emphasize. And then lastly, you are the experts and we need your input, and it is really important to us. All right, next slide, please. So how do you get involved? Well, first and foremost, complete the survey. We sent out an email to the RVTEC listserv on last Thursday, and it includes a link to the survey there. There's one here as well. When you go do the survey, there is a list of sensors, and you'll go through and indicate which sensors you're interested in contributing to best practice documents. The same list of sensors will be in the follow-up question as to whether or not you're interested in becoming a beta tester for the documents as they become available. You can do either or, you can do both. Check all that apply, please. You'll notice that not every sensor is probably listed. So if we don't have an option for a particular sensor that you're interested in, please use there's an other option and you can fill that information in. You'll notice that many sensors say general, and we recognize that even for something like a thermosalinograph, how you take care of an SB 45 versus a 21 may actually mandate different documents. So we'll work through that in identifying documents to develop. And then lastly, please share the link to the survey with your colleagues whom you might think would be interested in participating. You sail with scientists all the time, and you know which ones are out there haggling you about sensor maintenance. So include their names. We want them to be a part of this process as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's, what we see as our next steps. We'll gather the responses from the survey. The survey closes on November 20th, so don't anticipate any information from us before then, but please do complete the survey well before then. Once we have gathered responses, we'll work on organizing groups and kind of identifying leads. This is where we may split up sensors where there's multiple models, such as the thermosalinograph that I mentioned, into groups if they mandate generating, separate documents. We want to recognize, historically that, what has already been done. There may be documents that already exist and that we can reference, and we know the OBPS repository is a great place to start collecting this information. But we really wanted to ensure that these documents and what we develop reflect what a technician needs to do at sea. So while documents may exist for a particular sensor, we may have a slightly different perspective and focus within those documents that we develop. So once we've been able to review existing literature, we'll dive into the development of these best practices. We have a really great format for the CSTAR document, so we can use that kind of as a template for the future documents. When these documents are drafted and kind of viewed as ready for testing, we'll contact those who are interested in the beta testing and to actually try them out. And, I think this is a really important step. And I hope we get a lot of volunteers to try these out because it will speak to how realistic these practices are. And then from that feedback that we receive, we'll make appropriate edits and kind of finalize the documents for publication to OBPS. And as Mark mentioned, OBPS partners with Frontiers in Marine Science, a scientific journal. So there's opportunity there as well if we want to take it a step further. Next slide, please. Last slide. So lastly, this is just an acknowledgement slide. And, really thank you to RVTEC for giving us some time to speak about this. And lastly, we hope that you will consider participating in this effort. And again, please sign up for our Slack channel if you haven't already, and we're happy to answer any and all questions. So thank you.
We have had a question from Gabe that came up in the Slack and was also answered in the Slack, but maybe you want to touch on it here for a minute. It sounds like anyone can post. These procedures may or may not be published in Frontiers in Marine Science. Is there any other vetting, proofing, validation of these procedures?
Within the steering group, we're somewhat divided. Some folks say you vote with your feet, and so if there's a lot of downloads, then there must be some interest in it, and that would give it some weight. Within the steering group, we don't have expertise in all the different facets of oceanography, so we can't do it. It really has to come from the community, and we're working on this endorsement process. For example, one of the things I've submitted is the 13 Quartod manuals that have been created under IUS. And, you know, they're signed off by the director of IUS. They've been through a series of reviews, ending with an international review. So they're very clearly best practices. And I guess what we're going to have to do is come up with a way where NOAA can endorse a document or something like that, or have Global Ocean Observing System endorse NOAA documents. It's a work in progress, but that's where we stand. I wish I had a better answer.
That's great. That's what we have for questions in the Slack right now. But you guys will be here all week, right? Checking out the Slack. I appreciate how active you've been in your channel. And again, I know it's been plugged a couple of times, but this was added after the original agenda. So those of you who joined the Slack early have not been automatically added to this channel. So I encourage you to join it and feedback. We are done early today. So is there any closing remarks that we need to make or prepare for tomorrow? I think we've learned a lot about how this whole Slack YouTube meeting is going to work. Questions, thoughts?
You did great, Brandy.
This has been a great first day.
The only thing I would add is that we hope RVTEC will come to our annual workshop next year with a year's worth of experience from the Ocean Best Practice System, and tell us what we should change to make things better.
Great. Let's make sure an announcement goes into the RVTEC mailing list when that's live.
Okay. Yep.
Closing thoughts, Lee?
No, I just want to thank all our presenters today and everyone participating in Slack. I look forward to another productive day tomorrow.
For those of you who are presenting tomorrow, I'll be sending you instructions before the end of the day when this wraps up. Well, thank you.
All right, y'all. Bye for now.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
This was great.
Okay, I ended the stream.